Good afternoon. My name is Chris Faricy, and I am the director of the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and the Hicker Family Professor in Renewing Democratic Community. I would like to welcome the audience here in the auditorium and also online to our State of Democracy panel, which is also an event in the Maxwell School's Centennial Election Series. I'd like to thank Norman and Marcia Lee Berkman, along with George and Kathy Hicker, for their generous support in helping fund this series. And before we begin, I would like to acknowledge with respect the Onondaga Nation, the Firekeepers of the Haudenosaunee, the indigenous people on whose ancestral lands Syracuse University now stands. Earlier this fall, I was in Philadelphia for a professional conference, and I took the opportunity to go to Independence Hall, a place I had always wanted to go to. And I stood in the assembly room in Independence Hall, where in 1776, the Second Continental Congress signed the Declaration of Independence, and 11 years later, in the same room, delegates to the Constitutional Convention created and signed the U.S. Constitution. And as I was standing in the assembly room, I looked and saw a chair that as a child I saw in a painting in my history books. And it was George Washington's chair that he used during the proceedings. And when I looked at the chair, I saw the etching of the half-sun on the headpiece that you see in the picture in front of you. And I recall the story I remember learning about in school, how at the end of the Constitutional Convention, Benjamin Franklin turned and remarked to James Madison that during the course of the convention, he had been wondering whether the sun on the back of Washington's chair was a rising sun or a setting sun. And I couldn't help but think of that story this week as I took in Americans' divided reaction to the 2024 presidential election. There are some parts of the country, and I'm sure there are people in this room, who see the election of Donald Trump as evidence of a rising sun in America. They hope for a stronger economy, and they see someone who is not only reorientating the Republican Party, but possibly the United States against decades-long bipartisan consensus of elites in issues like immigration, international trade, and foreign policy. But there are also people across the country and in this room who, when they see the results of the 2024 election, see a setting sun of the promise of a multiracial, multi-ethnic democracy that would bend the arc of history towards equality and justice for all. And there are groups, immigrant communities, non-gender conforming citizens, and women who felt targeted by the Trump campaign and are fearful of what a second term might bring. And there are people across the aisle who are concerned about the health of American democracy. These are indeed polarized and perilous times. And this polarization is exacerbated by how we get information about politics and policy. Opinion journalists, social media, pundits, they use the prism of conflict as a way to present information on politics and policy. Left versus right, Democrats versus Republicans, who's winning and who's losing on the day. We come here together this afternoon to have a different conversation. A conversation that is had in the halls of Maxwell and in our classrooms. A different conversation. The people on this stage share a lens that is different than how most people consume politics and policy. And that common denominator is curiosity. Being curious about the world. The world the way it is. Not the way that we want it to be, not the world according to folk theorems, but curious, deeply curious about trying to understand the world as it is. Because if we're some of the sentiments of the Athenian oath that's etched on the outside of this wall, to leave a city better and more beautiful than we found it, the very first thing you must do is to understand the city, to deal with the complexity of the country you live in, and the government and how it functions, to lean into the gray areas of policy, and realize that there are no easy answers, and that to understand the complexity of American government is hard work. And today, we're here to do that hard work of trying to understand American democracy. So let's meet our panelists. I'd like to start with our guest. Michael Minta is a professor of political science and director of graduate studies at the University of Minnesota. He's a leading expert in the study of political representation of African Americans and Latino interests in the United States. He has written and published numerous books and articles on minority representation in the U.S. Congress and by organized interest. In his latest book, No Longer Outsiders, Black and Latino Interest Groups Advocacy on Capitol Hill, won the 2023 W.E.B. Du Bois Distinguished Book Award presented by the National Conference of Black Political Scientists. Next, we have Jenn Jackson, an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science. They also hold faculty affiliations in African American Studies, Women and Gender Studies, and LGBT Studies. And they're also a senior research associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute. Jackson's primary research interests are in Black politics with a focus on racial threat and trauma, gender and sexuality, political behavior, and social movements. Jackson is the author of the book Black Women Taught Us. Emily Thorson is an assistant professor in the Department of Political Science and also a senior research associate at the Campbell Public Affairs Institute. Thorson's research interests are in American politics, misinformation and misperceptions, experimental methodology, political psychology, and media and politics. She is the author of the book The Invented State: Policy Misperceptions in the American Public. Last, we have Grant Reeher, who is a senior research associate in the Campbell Public Affairs Institute and former director, and professor of political science. Reeher is the creator, host, and producer of the Campbell Conversations on WRVO Public Media. It's a weekly regional NPR public affairs show featuring extended in-depth interviews with regional and national writers, politicians, activists, public officials, and business professionals. Welcome to our panel. So today's session will be divided into two parts. In the first 50 minutes, I'm going to moderate a discussion with our panel, and then for the second half, we'll open it up to audience questions. So I actually brought a visual aid for the first question. And I'm going to ask a question about how we interpret the 2024 election. And I'll say this, here's what we know. President-elect Trump made gains all over the country. Suburban counties, urban counties, ex-urban counties. He made gains across demographics. So if you would go home today and turn on cable news, and I beg of you, don't go home today and turn on cable news. You might hear explanations for this victory, such as not having enough reach out to the Latino community, or not having a better message about economic policy. What I can tell you is that no small individual explanation can explain a victory in which all these groups moved all across the country. A small explanation cannot explain a large phenomenon. So what are we left with? I'm going to present a theory of the case, and then I'd love to get the panelists' thoughts on the theory of the case for the 2024 result. And here's the theory. This chart I have behind me is from the Financial Times, and it shows from the late 40s till 2024 incumbents in democracies across the world, right? So we're now going to take the 2024 election and we're going to put it into a larger, both historical and international framework. This was the only year on record, going back over 75 years, in which every incumbent in every democracy who ran in 2024 lost. Every single one. And that's what this shows with the lines below that center line. So here's the theory. The pandemic hit. And after 30 years of little to no inflation, governments responded with stimulus programs. There were disruptions in the supply side chains, and inflation spiked all over. And people were upset. They felt it in their pocketbook. And when people got upset about the economic times and inflation, they took it out on the incumbent party. And therefore, it would not have mattered who the Democratic candidate was, what type of campaign they would have run, what their messaging would have been. Any Democrat or person in control of the White House would have lost the 2024 election. It was a change election, and a change election means that the challenger wins. So that's the theory of the case, and I'd love to hear the panelists respond to that. Right, wrong, needs nuance?
Yeah, that checks out.
Okay.
You looking for a wrong?
Sure, I'm looking for any conditions or...
I think it's wrong.
Okay, tell us what.
I think it's wrong because, first of all, it doesn't explain 2016 here in the United States. I see 2016 and 2024 as being the thing that needs to be explained. So I think it's possible that the United States certainly could be an outlier even among whatever that general trend is in 2024. So I don't think, I agree with you that we're not going to find one smoking gun or one answer. But I do think there are some things systematically that have been going on with the Democratic Party's messaging in particular that Donald Trump was able to take advantage of, both in 16 and 24. And so I think that the answer is more, I don't know if that translates to other countries, but I don't think we need the other countries to explain what's going on here.
Well, hello everyone. Thanks for coming on a Friday, and it's nice to be here in Syracuse. So Chris, I mean, that's kind of like the standard explanation, right, of economics and what Bill Clinton in the 90s and Carville, is the economy's stupid. But I mean, I was just looking at some of this exit poll data that's still in process, so don't take exit poll data from CNN as the gospel.
Thank you for saying that.
Yeah, yes. But I was looking at unions. I mean, unions aren't everywhere, but, you know, I looked in Pennsylvania and I looked at the union households, and that's about, I think about 19–20%. And Harris won, the Democrats won like about 54%. People who went out to vote said they voted for Harris who were in unions. 45% voted for Trump. Now, if this was an issue about economics, then why are union people voting for Donald Trump? And many of you guys probably saw the Republican National Convention. Maybe, maybe not. Well, you saw the Teamsters president come up there, and man, did he look like a fish out of water? I mean, he's up there telling jokes to the wrong audience. I mean, it's like no one was laughing. And you're like, wait a minute, that's the wrong crowd. And so, you know, if this truly was about economics, and we're talking about some of these Midwestern states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, Democrats usually are the friends of unions. And so something else had to be motivating what was going on. And, you know, Grant was talking about, 2016 and 2024. And I think we do, and I mean, you don't have to have a PhD in order to see the two things that were happening in 2016 and who Trump was against. You know, Hillary Clinton in 2016 and Kamala Harris in 2024. Again, I'm not saying economic anxieties aren't part of the issue, but it's always an issue. You can look at any poll over time and you will see economics is in the top 5, if not the top 3. You know, in 2020, it was the coronavirus, so everyone's worried about that. People are making their vote choice based on that. In 2008, when Obama was running, we had the Great Recession, so people were making their decisions on that. Again, something else is going on than just pure economics, and we're going to have a nice conversation about that.
I'd love to hop in here.
Yeah,
as the resident intersectional feminist on the panel, I'd like to bring into the room that economics, capitalism, we can't ever consider from other considerations like race and gender. And we've seen mass conservatism all over the world. I am not a world politics scholar. I study the US. However, I have eyes and ears, and I am able to use them to witness what has been happening for the last decade and a half. So when we think about economics being a prime kind of motivator of this voting behavior, sure. But that's not at all mutually exclusive with relation to the fact that we're talking about Hillary Clinton, who was a woman, Kamala Harris, who's a black woman, and there's still this sentiment among many in America and around the globe that minority folks who are at the margins of identity, are not proper for these types of roles. My gender students in the room who are in my gender and politics class, we're reading about this right now, right? We have tons of theories about glass walls, glass ceilings, glass cliffs, where women are often propped up and elevated into positions of authority in politics just to be set up to fail. Right? I want to also say that, sure, maybe economics is part of the conversation. I'm sure it is, right? But we have to also be talking about race and gender simultaneously, and that is a global phenomenon because we know anti-blackness is global, patriarchy is global, misogynoir is global.
So let's. I want to ask a follow-up about the race and gender question. In 2016, Clinton's slogan was "I'm with her," right? And Harris was "I'm for you." And if you look at her campaign, feminism was through the issue of abortion, right? She talked a little bit about her personal story, but in no way was there talk about breaking the glass ceiling in ways that Clinton leaned into to 2016. So if we have this story about people were hesitant to vote for a mixed race black woman, what do we think about the fact that she de-emphasized that in her campaign? Was that a mistake? I mean, like, I guess there's an alternative version where I'm thinking of like Stacey Abrams in Georgia, where she interwove her story about being a black woman in the South with her policy agenda and made that part of this is why I'm an American. Would that have been a more successful track?
Is this for me too?
It's for anyone, yeah.
Okay, I'd love to start it. So I think this is such an important question, right? I think when we think about VP Harris and what she chose to de-emphasize in the campaign, right, we have to think about these stereotypes about Black women. And Hillary Clinton did the same thing, right? She was susceptible to other stereotypes. She had to deal with the stereotype of the Iron Lady, the Iron Maiden, right? Too harsh. If she sneezed, it was because she was weak, but if she said no to someone, it was because she was mean and masculine. You know, VP Harris was in the same boat. And so what she leaned into was a kind of equal and opposite caricature of who she was running up against, right? She tried to present herself as more masculine. I've got a Glock at home. Right? You know, and she represented a certain type of what we would call state feminism, right? A state-based feminism is a feminism that is rooted in these ideas of certain policy agendas being the ways that one's feminism is articulated. Abortion policy, education policy, family related policies, but not necessarily a feminism rooted in the ways that folks live their lives every single day. So for many young Americans between the ages of 18 and 40, even the way she de-emphasized certain aspects of her character still didn't highlight and elevate the types of issues they were concerned about because she wasn't speaking to them, right? In a lot of respects, she was speaking to disaffected Gen Xer, Midwestern, white male voters who care that she might have a Glock at home, right? Who want to see her as someone who can be tough on the economy. That's why she said, we're going to have the strongest military. We're going to really blow some things up, right? I added that part, right? So I think that kind of bravado, right, was the equal and opposite representation of who she was running against, but it was not representative of what we would have expected, right, of someone of her personal identities. And that may have been a mistake. We'll talk about it for the next 4 years, I'm sure.
Well, you know, the one thing I wanted to say is, I mean, Kamala Harris was put in a very tough spot, right? I mean, there were a lot of unprecedented things, right? Like, you know, a president, incumbent president being forced, he didn't do it voluntarily, despite what people said, who was basically forced out of the race because, lo and behold, Democrats discovered that he was old. You're like, okay, we kind of knew this. This wasn't new information, and this push to move them out. And for the most part, Democrats only had one choice. You know, they said stuff about a mini primary, but that was unlikely. I mean, it's just not enough time to really have all that fighting. So you had to coalesce around one candidate. And so, but you know, one thing, Black folks are kind of used to, they're called in when there's a mess and expecting her to clean it up, right? And then when she doesn't clean it up,
it's her fault.
It's your fault.
But I want to be clear that the Harris campaign did really well. The Harris campaign did much better in battleground states than in non-battleground states. Where they competed, they did better, which clearly suggests that her message was resonating with voters. Not enough to overcome this kind of, this resistance to the status quo that's evidenced. Clearly, the campaign did everything they could have. If a campaign had chosen the wrong path, if they had done the wrong things, then we would have seen the opposite pattern, right? We would have seen Democrats doing worse in states where Harris campaigned. That is not what happened. So I think it would behoove us to stop kind of saying, okay, well, let's relitigate every choice that campaign made and instead look to what we can do moving forward.
Yeah, well, and Chris,
Sure.
and what, so I wanted, she was just in a tough spot, right? But the biggest thing about, you said emphasizing her story, her race, her ethnicity. I mean, she leaked out who she was. I mean, leaked it out, but I mean, like, she talked about her background, but by telling her story about her mother, and she didn't say as much about her father. She sent a lot of signals, right, that she was Black and she was South Asian. You know, she talked about going to Howard University and being proud, and to people that, yeah, this is historic. You haven't had anyone who's at the top of the ticket went to a historically Black college or university. So she sent that signaling. But you're right, she didn't do like Hillary Clinton saying, you know, I'm going to break that glass ceiling, because she knows that there's a lot of sexism out there, and there's no need to basically try to bring more attention to it. And as Jenn was saying, she tried to emphasize her strengths, right? Like, look, I'm tough, I got a gun, and don't mess with me. And how we're gonna have the most lethal fighting military force, those type of things. That many voters were skeptical that a woman could actually be a tough person on the world stage. So I think and then race, Obama did it. Some people try to, a lot of black candidates have learned you don't run these racialized campaigns, because if you turn it into a race issue, then surely you're going to get voted against, and there's going to be higher turnout for that. Now, her campaign wasn't long enough. We had a scholar, we have political science research that a lot of candidates, particularly black candidates, they like to use this racial distancing, where they kind of chastise the black community in order to show to the greater community, I'm not beholden to that particular community, and that I will represent the interest of all. So, but maybe she would have done it if the campaign was longer, but she did not do that.
I want to add something to what Dr. Thorson just said, which I think is really important about how VP Harris's campaign performed in places when we compare them to the campaign to Biden's campaign. She did well, but I think what was really interesting was watching the kind of vote returns in these deeply blue districts, in these deeply blue counties. She still didn't do as well as Biden. And all across the country, in places where she was expected to do better simply because it's always been that way, that didn't happen. And that's why I brought in race and gender, because I think that we have to talk about something called misogynoir, which is a feeling of the intersections of racism and sexism shaping the ways that folks get to navigate the world. And I talk to my students about this all the time. Our political imaginations are deeply based on the representation that we've already experienced and seen our whole lives. And I think it's hard for some people to imagine a VP Harris becoming a President Harris. Let's just call it what it is, right? There's a lot of people who could not imagine this. We say black and Asian, yes, but again, I don't want to go back to history, okay? But people see her as black, just like, Barack Obama is black and white, but people see him as black, right? Seeing this black woman in the White House. And I sometimes feel like in a fear of talking about the centrality of race as an organizing feature of society and of much of the world, we downplay the significance of its role in our politics, when 71% of the overall votes came from white America. We don't need to talk about the 6% of black men and what they did, and the 5% of Latinx men and what they did, and the 5% of Latinx Latino women and what they did, right? Because the truth of the matter is, white Americans decided the outcome of this election, period. And there are generational cohorts, Gen X and Gen Z, who overwhelmingly supported a Trump administration. So when we think about who white Gen Xers and white Gen Zers are, I think we can have a much more interesting conversation than looking at VP Harris and seeing what she did and didn't do to win them over.
Okay, great, thank you. Okay.
Yeah, I want to jump in here, and I want to push back against some of the things I'm hearing, but then I also want to be in heated agreement with the idea that Kamala Harris had a lot of the cards stacked against her, and I think she did run a valiant campaign, and given the 107 days that she had to do it, I think the fact that the election, and given the numbers that were there, Biden was tanking at the time that she took this over. She really brought those back up again. I do think there were some unforced errors. If we want to get down to the picking of nits, I think she could have defined herself policy-wise much better than she did. She was deliberately vague. That was obviously a strategy that was chosen. But I want to go back to your theory of the case and maybe propose an alternative theory of the case.
Okay.
And I don't want to go after Kamala Harris so much. Again, I think she ran a valiant campaign. I do, though, want to have a little argument with the Democratic Party. And let me just point out some things here that sort of lead me to thinking in this way. Just bear in mind here in this last election, Trump did better than he had before across all ethnic categories. He improved everywhere. 90% of the counties in this country, he did better in. So it was something very general. The second thing to bear in mind is we have to always remember how polarized this country is and has been for 20 years. So what we're really arguing about here is how to shift the dial of the vote 3 or 4%. That's what we're talking about, because that's all the room that there is to move. Each side is going to get 43% no matter what they do. They could run an absolute corpse or a ham sandwich. They're going to get 43%. So Trump wins this election. It's despite the endorsement of Taylor Swift. It's despite the endorsement of Bruce Springsteen. If you look at he's got Hogan on his side. Okay, that seems a bit imbalanced to me there, just looking at that. So I think there's a...
You're forgetting Joe Rogan.
Oh, yeah, there we go. And skipping that was a mistake for her, too. And skipping the Al Smith dinner was a mistake, too. But I don't think that's what's going on. The Democrats, I think, have a much bigger problem than this election. They've lost twice now to Donald Trump. Twice to Donald Trump, okay? Imagine if Nikki Haley had been the nominee for the Republicans this time around instead of Donald Trump. I think we would have been looking at an election that looked like 1984, okay? I think it would have been a much bigger win. The exit polls clearly showed that people were concerned about the economy and affordability and security and safety. But we have to ask why they look less to the Democratic Party for those things. I mean, I'm picking up on Michael's point. That's historically the wheelhouse for the Democratic Party. So what is going on? I think, and when I call this a problem, I'm looking at it from the standpoint of winning an election. Okay, so I'm not making the big theoretical arguments that Jenn is making. I'm sort of the detail guy here, just trying to, eke out a win here, thinking about it from their perspective. But you have to ask why they look less to the Democratic Party. And I think the reason is that for the last 15, 20 years, the Democratic Party has been increasingly defining itself as a party of identity. And I just don't think that's working. And so I think my own personal advice to them would be, go back to being more a party of class. Go back more to being a party of economic kinds of issues. So I guess this is kind of a long-winded way of saying it's the economy stupid again. But I think, I don't think the problem is a black woman was running. I think the problem is the identity of the party. And that is why you're seeing people from all ethnic groups beginning to turn away from it more, because you're not speaking to that thing that they care about.
Yeah. So I'm going to shift a little bit. There's a lot of kind of Monday morning quarterbacking about parties and candidates and campaigns, but here's one thing that you're not going to hear probably outside of this room or outside of this building. I want to turn the attention to voters. So when the media talks about, and a word you're going to hear a lot in the next month is presidential mandate. There's an assumption under this idea of presidential mandate that voters, when they're walking into a booth, have firm policy preferences, that they're connecting these preferences and they know the agenda that they're voting for. And therefore, when a president wins a decisive victory, that they have a mandate from the people to execute their agenda. And the ability of the voter to participate in democracy and be an informed voter is something that is not scrutinized in the media, but it is in political science, right? So what I want to do is, instead of litigating or relitigating the campaign and the candidates, I want to put the voter on trial, right? So I want to hear from you, based upon your own research and based upon your understanding of the political science research, are voters, the majority of voters, capable of walking into a ballot box and casting an informed vote based upon policy? And Emily, you just wrote a book about this, so I want to start with you.
Yeah, Absolutely. I think voters are far more capable than we give them credit for, but we don't provide the information that they need to make these informed decisions, right? And so, we have a concept in political science called retrospective voting, which is you sort of look to see how things are going. If they're going well, you vote for the incumbent. If they're going poorly, you kick the incumbent out, right? And we kind of see this exactly in this graph, right? That things were not going well. People were feeling like housing was too expensive, inflation was through the roof, so they said, okay, we want something new. Right, but in order to sort of make retrospective voting work, you need to actually have an understanding of how your economic situation, the cost of housing, inflation, gas prices, is connected to and controlled by the government. And the answer to that is policy. People need to understand how public policy actually works and how it benefits them. And there is, in my research, I show there is a deep desire for the public to know what the government is actually doing, how the government is spending their money. But unfortunately, the media almost entirely fail to provide this. For example, when I code articles in newspapers and on TV about Medicare, say, right, a policy that a lot of people benefit from, again and again, news coverage of this talks about what the candidates are going to do about it, maybe in the future, but they don't tell people what is Medicare, right? How does it actually work? I don't know if any of you remember during the ACA, the Affordable Care Act debates, people made fun of a voter holding up a sign that said, "Get your government hands off my Medicare," right? And this was a source of derision. I think that this is a failure of our information system. This is a failure of the media to provide this basic descriptive information that people need to engage in retrospective voting. So I do not blame voters. I think they are incredibly competent. But what can they do if they don't have that information available to them?
I agree 100%. I think, and this shows up in my data as well, not about things like Medicare, but about abolition, right? My new book, Policing Blackness, I talk to young Black Americans all over the country, but I also have survey data that looks at people about this term abolition and how afraid they are of this idea of abolition, abolishing prisons, about abolishing police. But when you break down the pieces of abolition, you say, well, what about investing less in police and more in education or healthcare services or community services? They're like, oh yeah, that sounds fine. I think I'm okay with that. And it's like, that's abolition, right? And so I think you're exactly right. And I kind of want to web this answer with part of Grant's answer to say, I think this idea that the Democratic Party is too much about identity is a little bit strange, given that under Barack Obama, I feel like that's when the Democratic Party was more about identity than anything else. We had a president stand up and said that Trayvon Martin could be his own son. That's the first time I ever sat and saw a president say something that made me feel, as a young Black American who grew up in a city on the top 10 worst cities in the country, seen by a president. And I think the point that I think is important that brings these 2 points together is that voters are very sophisticated. Yes, they have lack of access to quality data and information, but we are all living in very different worlds. And we don't talk about that enough. My data shows that when we talk about policing, overwhelmingly in my data, significant numbers of young white Americans say, I don't even understand this. Why would you need to walk in smaller groups to not seem suspicious? I've never done that before. Why would I ever call someone else instead of the police? I call them first. Meanwhile, young Latinx Americans, Black Americans, and Asian Americans are saying, oh no, we do whatever we can to not call the police so that we don't escalate a situation. Completely different life experiences. So it's not just about identity, it's about a material and empirical world that is shaped by those identities, whether we want them to be or not. And that also shapes the kind of information we have access to, the people we hang around with, the neighborhoods we live in, and who we call our comrades and kin. So I want us to understand that identity is not something we just put in our pockets and bring with us into rooms where we want to have them. That actually shapes the material world around us, the ecosystems that we engage with, and that's how people voted in this election and in every election that we've seen.
Well, I like that Emily believes that a lot of confidence in voters. I mean, we have a lot of political science research where we have very little confidence, and even our founders had very little confidence in in the electorate and
They got a lot wrong.
Well, but I'm
Literally.
just saying, even the system that we have, right, is they didn't trust the voters. That's why we have a representative democracy and all these different layers. Now, obviously, we've made changes over time to give people more of a say, but for the most part, there are concerns about the masses and enacting policies that would oppress the minority, and also the minority. Not too much concern about them, but they also have concerns about the minority oppressing the majority. And I do think voters have a lot of ability to make decisions if they're paying attention. Like, many of us in here, we probably follow politics all the time. We look at it, we pay attention, but most people don't, and they don't care, and it's something they do in passing, and so they do have to rely on other mechanisms in order to try to get information. Now, political parties aren't vested in giving voters unbiased information, right? That's not their goal. Their goal is to win elections. And that's what's becoming in this polarized world, trying to win elections. I mean, when's the last time you've seen a presidential debate where the candidates just agreed on everything? Yeah, I agree with you on this. Yeah, I agree with you on that. A few things, but most of the time they're not agreeing. It's adversarial in nature, and so it's hard to get information that can help you make a decision because they're fighting, and sometimes fighting over stuff that's unnecessary. I mean, back we were talking about the Affordable Care Act. Things like, oh, you can keep your kid on your insurance until they're 20-something. Oh, you don't have lifetime limit. And when you call it an Affordable Care Act, almost all Americans are like, oh yeah, we like that. Obamacare. No. Oh no, I hate that. This sucks. It's terrible. It's going to take away my Medicare. So like when you politicize something, when it becomes partisan, that's when people start fighting. And I will say this too, and people sometimes get on me when I say this. I do believe that we have more like Americans than we have differences. I really do. But the way our system is set up to win elections, political parties, they have to figure out ways to drive people apart. So think about the issue of immigration. Give me an example of that. Democrats, Republicans, the elites, we value immigration. But when it comes into partisan debates, we turn it in. I mean, think about it. There are a lot of immigrants on it's not just people that are coming and working low-skill, low-wage jobs. We have high-tech people coming over working in industry businesses that many Republicans hire and they value. But when we start talking about immigration, that's when it starts becoming into some of the scapegoating when you start looking at south of the border. So like I live in Minnesota, and people are worried about immigration and the border in Mexico and Texas. I was like, wait a minute, Canada? Are you worried about immigration in Canada? No, I'm really worried about safe and crime. And they were in freaking Minnesota. Why are you, we do have a large immigrant population, but it's not, not as large as Texas, but still, the way it's been used as a divisive issue. And Grant, one thing I will say, Democrats aren't the only one necessarily engaging in identity politics. Republicans are engaging in identity politics when they say that you're not talking, they're not part of us, they're eating our pets. Stuff like that, the enemy from within. And I know they're not just talking about racial, but they're talking about a lot of different things where it's others, where they're not true Americans. And like the only Americans that live in the United States live in rural America. And that's just not a case. There's the working class. We hear this stuff, political scientists, social scientists like to define working class as people who don't have a college degree. Now, I know they're trying to change that metric because most people don't have a 4-year college degree, right? And so, but there are many blacks, Latinos who would be called working class. But many people say the Democrats, their message isn't going there. Well, you have to expand your definition of what the working class is. It's not just people that are working in rural Wisconsin, rural Minnesota. And so I think that's what our country is grappling with, on how to incorporate these different groups that have different interests. But I do think that parties, and I'm not going to just say to me, I think political parties play a big role in fostering these divisions. And it's solely to win elections. So again, instead of emphasizing what binds us together, and if, when you travel internationally, you really know what it feels to be an American. You really do. You're like, oh gosh, yes. We criticize our leaders here, and we're not put in jail. You don't think about going to jail, right, when you criticize our political leaders. But in some countries, you can, and you could be killed. So, I mean, we have a great country, but again, we have to understand that the parties don't help. And we could talk about different reforms, but I'll shut up.
So let me put some boundaries around what I was trying to say before. And first of all, just make very clear, the absence of my observation about the Republican Party was not meant in any way, shape, or form to be some sort of endorsement or giving them a pass on it. But they won this election, and I'm addressing the party that lost this election. I think it's real important. I think Emily spoke to it really eloquently, that it's important that we don't try to blame the voters here in any way. And I have heard that over the course of last week. I think not only is that off base, it's also, again, I guess I'm going back to a political strategy here, it's toxic. So you're not going to get anywhere with that. You're just going to lose by a larger margin if that's going to be your explanation. So I guess what I wanted to say, and to Jenn's points, I get, or I think I get what you're saying, and I see the value of it from the standpoint of understanding the reality of the situation. But I guess I remain unconvinced that can be the leading edge of a political message. And so what I do think I'm right about is that if the party were to change what its central argument for itself is and for its candidates are, it's not going to completely address the things that you're talking about, Jenn, but it will address a lot of it. It won't get it all, but it'll get a lot of it, and it'll have a hell of a lot better chance of actually winning. And that, to me, is kind of the way I think about it. Now, again, I guess I'm just being this strategist when I say that. But so again, when you look at the pattern here, it seems to speak pretty clearly to that. And back to your original theory of the case, Chris, the other thing is, if you were right about this, I think we would have seen a much larger margin of victory. Because, we still haven't counted all the popular votes yet, but at the very best for Trump, wasn't going to be like 2-3%, something like that. So it was close. It was close.
Well, he was not an ideal candidate. Yeah. Let's put it that way, right? I mean, he's a very disliked candidate, even by the Republican Party.
Absolutely.
So I think that could explain.
That's my point about the Democratic Party has now lost twice to this guy. So if that isn't an occasion for self-examination, I don't know what is.
Okay. So let me bring this back again to a broader scope. And one of the things that people try to do after elections is look at changes in voting patterns and see if there's something what's called a partisan realignment, where there are groups shifting allegiances. And what's interesting is that if you look at American politics from the 30,000-foot level over the last 20 some odd years, you would say the country's polarized 50-50. But that hides churn that has happened underneath that 50-50, where groups have been shifting. And a couple areas that people have pointed to, and I'm thinking about, not analyzing, as Michael said, the exit polls right now, because that's a dangerous game. They're not very good in the United States. But if we think back to 2016, which has been brought up a couple times, so we look at 2016, 2020, and the early information we have here, I want to ask about two patterns. So the first, Emily, I'll start with you, is that one thing we've seen shift is what's called the diploma divide, right? So 30 years ago, if you were college educated, you were more likely to vote Republican, and now college graduates are firmly in the Democratic camp. And if you have less than a college education, you were a tried and true Democrat in the 80s, and now that group is leaning a little bit more towards the Republican side. So what are we to make of this? Like this is a definitive shift that's happened in American politics since at least the 1990s. How can you explain it?
Well, it's a shift, but I don't want to oversell it. There are still many college graduates who are voting for Republicans and many working class Americans who are voting for Democrats, right? So I think there's a tendency to talk about these shifts as kind of all-encompassing when often they are kind of at the margins, and I think this one is as well. But it's real. Just because it's relatively small does not mean it's real. Like you said, if you wanted to guess someone's party 30 years ago and all you knew was that they were a college graduate, your best bet is to guess they're a Republican. Now it's the opposite. So I think there's one of the things that's really interesting in this is that this has been driven partially by the Republican Party, and especially its anti-institutionalist rhetoric. So especially in the last decade, the Republican Party has really kind of positioned itself as a party that is against a lot of the existing institutions in the United States, including the media, including academia, including increasingly kind of science. And what this means is that people with a college degree are increasingly moving towards the Democratic Party, and working class people are moving to a smaller degree towards the Republican Party. And you know, I think one of the things that's interesting to think about is whether this is a good long-term strategy for Republicans, because what it means is that when Donald Trump is trying to find qualified people to staff the federal bureaucracy, it's going to be really hard because the educated people that he needs to run the government are liberals, and he has expressly said that he does not want to hire liberals. This is going to have some kind of long-term consequences for the health of our federal bureaucracies as well. But as you said, Chris, it's a real pattern.
Thanks. So the next trend I wanted to throw at you, and Jenn and Michael especially, to hear your thoughts on this, is the idea that the country is becoming less polarized along the lines of race and ethnicity and more polarized along the lines of gender. Is there anything to that?
Less polarized on race? Yeah, I don't think that's changed. Yeah, I don't think that's changed. Gender, I mean, there's always been the divide, right? The intersection of, and Jenn could probably talk about this more, this intersection between race and gender. You know, we hear, you know, the women's vote, the woman's vote, and you know, you always have to break that down based on race and ethnicity in order to examine that. And then you have to look at it by education, right? So white women with college degrees tend to vote for Democrats, and that's most of the data over the past few have borne that out. White women without college degrees overwhelmingly support the Republican Party. And I think that's the, I've seen, I mean, guys try to stay off social media. I try to stay off, but I can't help it, right? And they're like, see, you know, they're talking about this coalition and reproductive health and white women let us down again. I was like, wait a minute, it's hard to have, like, wait a minute, you have to break down the data, right? So it depends on who you're talking about. And people with college degrees versus people without college degrees. And those patterns are very set in stone. Now the question is, I think Harris was hoping that reproductive health and abortion, and I think the Democrats, they thought that this was a winning strategy. That if they saw the 2022 midterm elections and they were like, oh, we didn't lose as badly as we thought, and it's because of Roe v. Wade, So now in 2024, I'm going to run on that, then I'm going to run on democracy, and this is going to be the winning strategy. It helped in some states, but it wasn't the winning strategy that they thought it was going to be in 2022. And I think that's something that Democrats are thinking about a lot. Like, and let me just say this, I think reproductive health is very important. I think Roe v. Wade is very important. But the question is, should it have been kind of like the main issue to try to unify the coalition? And then also democracy. Speaking about the Democratic Party becoming more of a party of elites or people that are college educated. Democracy, fascism. Look, these are real concerns, right? And we have these debates in the classroom. But you know, people in certain parts of, and it's not just rural America, you can go to cities and urban areas. I mean, they care about it, but they don't care about it as much as we care about it. But Democrats made that a big issue. And many of you saw in some of the polls, they thought that Kamala Harris and the Democrats were a bigger threat to democracy. So they had a different interpretation of what we mean by democratic institutions. And so I do think this is something that Democrats are really going to have to come to terms with what issues are going to get people out to the polls. And so again, I just thinking about that data, what you're saying about the college educated and the issues that people are concerned, that many people don't necessarily view them as the most important issue, that the way that we view those issues as being important.
Okay, so I think those questions are related. Because I just wish as academics, political scientists, that we all were intersectional feminists. I really struggle when I hear a college divide or a gender divide or a race divide, as if all these things are not interlocking. What do we know about education in the last 30 years? We know that Black women are now the highest degreed population in the country. College education has simultaneously become more affordable and not affordable depending on where you go, if it's a state school, if it's community college, if it's a feeder school into a larger school. So there are young people who have grown up working class, low income, poor, who are able to achieve a college education because for the millennial generation, we were told that's the only way you can survive. So there's no longer a racialized, segregated experience with college as there was 30, 40, 50 years ago, when we still weren't even being admitted, I say we meaning Black folk, into some schools. We have to always remember history, right? There's been times when women couldn't go to school. Black people couldn't go to school. So obviously, as time progresses, the college divide is going to shift because it's more accessible, right? When we talk about the gender divide is not new, and this debate over abortion is not new, but what we're forgetting is that when we talk about abortion, for those of us whose identities sit at multiple margins of identity, multiple margins of vulnerability, abortion rights are also tethered to reproductive justice and reproductive rights. There are trans folks and queer folks for whom abortion rights also attaches to their health care. Right? So we're not understanding that when we say abortion rights, we're not talking about cisgender, heterosexual white girls in Iowa. That's not the only group who's affected by this. We're talking about young Black people in inner cities all over the country who are afraid if the Planned Parenthood closes because that's the only place they can go to for health care. So I really want us to be thoughtful about trying to say, you know, is this the divide? Is that the divide? When what the Democrats may be coming up against is the fact that we cannot separate parts of ourselves from other parts of ourselves. We can't just focus on race. VP Harris struggled in part because I do think she saw abortion, I think her administration saw abortion as separate from a whole host of other issues. A lot of folks in this room, no shade, me too, right? Middle class, upper class. We have health coverage that comes from our universities or from our parents. That's not the people who are concerned about reproductive justice in the US, people who are worried that if abortion is not protected, they won't have access to safe abortion. They won't lose access to abortion. They'll lose access to safe abortions, which means we'll see more people dying from abortions. And more than likely, they will be Black people, people who are already susceptible to death related to maternal care and labor. You see what I'm saying? So abortion is not a conversation about just gender. It's also a conversation about race. It's also a conversation about class. So when we try to do this work of saying, well, we've seen this shift and we've seen this shift, what we're not paying attention to is the fact that maybe we're just not intersectional and the Democratic Party hasn't done enough reading.
Well, I think also, Jen, I think that I agree with you on this, and this speaks to, actually connects back to the kind of economy point from the beginning, that kind of we as pundits, professors, interested undergraduates, whatever it is, we kind of say, okay, well, people are worried about the economy or worried about the abortion, but it is really our job to kind of probe what those issues mean to people, right? And so when somebody says, I think the economy is going poorly, what does that actually mean? Are they talking about their housing? Are they talking about the cost of groceries? Are they talking about whether they can afford their kids' school supplies? Are they talking about having to pay for elder care? Same with abortion. When someone says I'm worried with abortion, what do they actually mean? And this calls for not just looking at survey top lines, but actually deep research where we talk to people, where we talk to everyday people and find out what these issues mean to them. And that will in turn, I think, inform much better strategy and more importantly, better policy information, because we need to get people the information they need to connect candidates' policy positions with their lived experience. And there's a big hole in the middle where people are clearly not making that connection.
Right. And that is a perfect lead-in to let's talk with people. So if you have a question for the panelists, please raise your hand and Jackie will come around and hand you the microphone. So we have first person up here, and then we have another person here, and then the third up there, Jackie. Thanks.
So you guys talked. Oh, it is. And so you guys talked a bit about how the Democrats should or should not change their messaging. My question is, we hear people like Bernie, for instance, saying, oh, the Democrats abandon the working class. You see other people like Tom Suozzi saying, oh, it's because they talk too much about trans issues. I mean, even if the Democrats did a complete 180 on their messaging and completely changed even everything, is it even possible, or are these shifts in the electorate beyond the control of any one message or any one party? Are they just sort of at the whim of global trends?
Can I jump in on this one?
Yeah.
So I think we may be in the midst of something that becomes as unmovable as what I think you're asking at the end, but I don't think we're there yet. And that's why I guess I'm emphasizing what I'm emphasizing about the messaging of the Democratic Party. I don't think we've reached that point yet. I don't think it's a 180. I think it's a 90. He needs to do. Not to go, just to what you lead with, what you emphasize. And so that's, I think the short answer to your question is no. This is still movable. This is not. We haven't had a 1932 election here. We just haven't. And so there's a lot of play in here to get that 4% that we're talking about. Now the polarization issue, that is the most important context against which all of this is happening. And that's not going away for a long time, because the forces that have built that are many and they're tectonic in our society and our economy. And so I will not see the end of that in my lifetime. My students will, but I'm not. And so, by the way, shout out to all my students who came. Thank you very much. But I do think that this thing is changeable in the short term. And I want to go back to something, if I could, take this question and go back to the last thing before we took questions?
Yep, real quick.
Okay, really quick. Your question was about the diploma divide, if I remember correctly, right? Okay. One of the problems there, and Raymond Wolfinger was famous for saying the plural of anecdote is data, okay? I'm going to go out on a limb here and say of the people on this panel, I think I've talked to more Trump voters and supporters than each of you has. Okay, here's what I'm getting. Here's what I'm getting. Most of those folks think that people like us look down on them, and they're pissed off about that. And so that has to change. And one way for that to change is for the Democratic Party to have the rethink I'm suggesting. So that's...
I just wanted to say, I actually think, Julian, this to me shows campaigns matter way less than we thought that they did. I do see this as I don't think we should teach a campaigns class anymore, at least not about electoral campaigns. Like policy issues, absolutely, right? There's still a lot of room for movement there, but Donald Trump ran a historically terrible campaign and still won, right? Because these underlying forces, exactly like you said, are so strong. And but again, sometimes they're not as strong, right? And so then maybe campaigns actually can swing things from one side to the other. But I do think a lesson for me from this, as someone who spent years working on campaigns, is maybe they don't matter as much as we thought they did.
Yeah. And I'll just add one quick thing, that whatever we think the Democratic Party should do, we're wrong. Yeah. Right? I'm old enough to remember in 2004, the diagnosis for the Democratic Party was to find someone white and rural from middle America, and then 4 years later, they nominated Barack Obama. And in 2012, the Republican autopsy was to pull back on anti-immigration stances, and 4 years later, they nominated Donald Trump. Right, so whatever the analysis is and the wisdom of what should be done, the democratic process will present us something different 4 years from now.
Well, and one thing I wanted to add to this in terms of the campaigns and also, campaigns, Donald Trump is, the question, what's happening with his campaign, and can another Republican replicate what Trump's done, right? I mean, this is a candidate that has so many disqualifying things that have happened to him that I don't think a typical politician could survive, right? And celebrities are treated, he was a celebrity before he ran. Celebrities are, we know research, they're treated differently. And so people see what they want to see in Trump. It's just amazing. You're like, oh, this is going to get him. This is done. And nope. He gets convicted. Now, again, we can debate on whether or not it should have been a misdemeanor versus a felony, but we know that he engaged in a cover-up with a prostitute, right? In a lot of places, that's disqualifying the politicians. Ask Eliot Spitzer, your former attorney general, and governor. But Trump got $50 million donation from Tim Mellon and promised another $50 million. Joe Biden has a bad debate. People find he's old. That's an understatement. They said he had, but again, he had a bad debate. The party leaders and the donors go. So, I don't know. A person that's older and having a bad debate versus somebody having felonies. I just think the money, the ability, I think if some of the donors, and we're not having this discussion, maybe you guys might ask, the donors, if Trump didn't have the type of support from some of these big wealthy donors, I don't know if his campaign would have been able to survive. But people kept giving him money. And you go look at the list, opensecrets.org or Washington Post, and look at the top 10 donors and see how much money the candidates have given him. Now, the question is, I just don't think that he would have been able to survive. We'll see.
Just one little factoid.
Just real quick so we can get the other
one
question.
Little factoid that sort of supports Michael's point here. If we think about the polling, the polling was off again. So it's been off now 3 times in a row. But it's only off on the Trump elections. The polling in the rest of the races in the country was not near that suggests
yeah.
there's something going on.
It was
with
within
that
the
guy.
statistical error, yeah. Yep.
So two questions. One is I was in Washington and my cab driver told me why the election results, and his analysis was that Americans have no taste for war, that Trump said he would end the wars, and Harris said she would continue the wars and that she would put money behind wars sort of under any conditions. So my first question is, how much do you think these isolationist tendencies affected the election on both sides? Because I'm not going to say Republicans are isolationist, Democrats are not. You can tell me that. And then my second question is, it feels like had Joe Biden had more influence on Kamala Harris's message, that it might have been more of a working class message. But it felt like he was iced, and so this notion that we're going to do it on abortion and democracy became the campaign rally. And I don't think Biden would have done that. And because of that, no one talked about what Biden had done. It was all, I'm not Joe Biden, I won't do that. But in fact, Joe Biden did a lot of really great stuff that nobody claimed. So I'm just wondering if you would comment on that as well.
Me? Oh, I'll take the first one. They're both great observations, Catherine. I think you're right on the first one. The strain of isolationism has run through this country's history from the beginning. I mean, it goes back to George Washington's farewell address, and it's part of the political DNA. And so there's this great book that was written just a couple of years ago. I'm blanking on the author's name now, but he's a professor at Yale, and it's about sort of America becoming a superpower along the same time that they continue this isolationist aspect of their core thinking. And so we're this very, very reluctant superpower in a way. So I think that did resonate. And I think your point about, I don't think it would have changed the election outcome probably in what you said, but it might have made it closer. I mean, it would have been harder. It would have been hard for her to say, I'm Joe Biden 2.0, and these are all the great things that she had to. She was in such a tough spot in so many different ways. She's got to differentiate, but not differentiate. But I think it would have made sense. And Michael, I just got to say, that was not a bad debate. Okay. That was a disastrous debate, okay? It was the end, but the only problem was we didn't get to that point fast enough. We drug it out. The country and the party.
I want to follow up a little bit on the second point about the Biden-Harris. And this comes from a question that a student gave in class yesterday, and that was, given the polarization we see in the country, is one of the reasons why presidents are hesitant to claim credit for policies. Do we see any way that presidents can pass good policies that help wide swaths of people and then be able to get rewarded for it at the ballot box?
You know, I think the Democrats let Republicans take the lead with, you know, and let's look, campaigns are not, we like to think of the campaigns like 2023, 2024, but these are ongoing. I mean, Republicans have been running the anti-immigrant and the reason why you're in the economic situation that you're in for many, many years. And it slowly, through each cycle, like I mean, they were talking about it in 2020, but it didn't resonate because we had the pandemic. 2022, still there, still talking about it. So whenever a political party can get you to focus on an issue and make your vote choice based on that issue, and that's what parties, that's why they're campaigning, that's their goal. If they can make you think, like you said, if you're having people in Minnesota and Wisconsin talking about what's going on south of the border, then they have won that debate. And it is strange, but it's a tough situation, right, with Biden and Harris. Like the infrastructure bill, the Inflation Reduction Act, all of these things that where they put money into in red districts and red states, but she didn't really talk much about that because Republicans were defining the debate. Now again, the Democrats did decide that reproductive health, Roe v. Wade in particular, was going to be the winning strategy. And even the whole debate about, are you better off 4 years than you were 4 years ago? And I was like, heck yeah, we're better off than 4 years ago. But they didn't say, the Democrats really didn't talk much about that. How?
Well, I mean, to their credit, if you look at public opinion data from this summer, when you ask people, how do you think the economy is doing? Thumbs down, huge thumbs down, right? And when you ask people, do you think the country's going in the right direction? People said, no, absolutely not. And so they were, I think, reluctant to say, hey guys, remember the economy? When everybody was clearly saying, yes, they did remember the economy and it was bad, right? And this is, again, I think what Grant said, the real bind that Harris put herself in, or that Harris was in. And again, many of the things that the Biden administration did during the pandemic that actually increased people's income and accessible money was then gone by the time the election came around, right? And so let's get back to Chris's point about how do politicians get rewarded. This is, I think, a kind of unique case because of the pandemic. I think in general, what politicians aim to do is put in place policies that benefit people and then continue to benefit people right up until Election Day, as opposed to Biden's policies, which did not. For good reason, but they did not.
Can I just add two things? Because I have no investments in who did what, and he should, she should. But I do want to say a couple things. The first that, when we talk about that debate between Biden and Trump, it's very interesting to me because they are 3 years apart. And we watched them argue over who could carry their golf bag further. Because they are both a little older, okay? And it's one of those situations where I think that your point, Dr. Minta, is well taken, that because of Trump's celebrity, the terms of debate, the terms of the campaign, the terms of the election have shifted. Debates look completely different now. There's just things happening, and my students were so shocked when they saw the VP debate. They're like, why were they so nice to each other? I'm like, that's how back in my day, that's how debates happened. You got up there and you talked and you treated people with respect, right? So I want to be clear here that the idea that somehow Biden had a bad debate and Trump didn't, that debate was hard to watch. Mind you, we've had whole rallies where Donald Trump danced for 45 minutes. Did we all see that? Okay, so I just want to be clear here that there is clearly a different set of standards here. And I just want I have to bring that into the conversation. And the other part I think that we're getting at with this whole abortion thing, we have to pay attention to how people voted down ballot. People split their ticket. They voted for a Republican president and then voted to enshrine abortion rights at the state level. This happened all over the country, even in Missouri. Choosing abortion as the issue was not a mistake. People cared about abortion. They just thought that if they voted for it at the state level, it'd be fine. And I think this goes back to what you said, Emily, right? Maybe they don't know that a president can actually make that not the case, right? I don't want us to say that abortion wasn't a good thing to run on. It was a great thing to run on. We saw that across the 7 out of 10 states that passed it this year, right? The issue is we've got a major problem in the U.S. where we don't actually know what people mean when they say the economy. We saw people arguing about what a tariff is and who's gonna pay it, right? They think that China's gonna pay us tariffs. That's not how tariffs work, right? We have a major problem where if Donald Trump gets up and says a thing, they believe it. I had students say, yeah, my friend told me they were shocked that Kamala Harris could speak so well. We've got a problem. So I'm not really invested in do you think she could do this? And when I say that we're living in different worlds, that's what I mean. And if we don't get down to the brass tacks of what a MAGA-ism, which is what he calls it, has done to politics, then we're not going to be talking about the same thing that they're talking about for the next 4 years.
Thank you.
Chris, I just wanted to say
Sure.
the first part of that question. I love talking to Uber drivers and cab drivers. They have very interesting perspectives on things. And, we were talking. So I wonder if it is, so part of that question about Americans don't want to be in wars and Trump said he's going to end it. Matter of fact, Trump said if he was in office, we would have never been in these conflicts and wars. We'll see if he does any of this stuff, right? Because he's going to be held to that standard. But the thing with Kamala Harris that you would hear, and I've heard this when Hillary Clinton was running, and you've probably heard these anecdotes. Can she stand up to world leaders? Will they take her seriously? Is she tough enough? And I mean, that's really discouraging to hear when you say that a person who's president of the United States, who just happens to be a woman, that she somehow won't command the respect of world leaders. And I mean, but people really believe that. And I'm not going to tell you the other foolishness I hear that they say about a woman and why she can't be commander-in-chief. Unbelievable stuff.
So let's hear an intelligent question from Curtis up there. Yeah.
No pressure.
Yeah.
All right. So Emily, you brought this up earlier about informing the public on policy. And this is something that I kind of wrestle with. How can you effectively inform the public on policy when voters look at policy through a partisan lens, and there's no incentive for news networks like Fox and MSNBC and political parties to inform them in a non-biased way?
I wish I could say there was like one silver bullet, but there's not. We got to work at it in a lot of different ways. First, for the partisan aspect, I will say, when in my kind of interviews with people and when I talk to people about policy, it is true that some policies are highly politicized, but there's far more that are not, that people don't have strong partisan attachments to. Social Security, for example, even Medicare, it does not seem through a partisan lens. So many of the policies that actually affect people in their everyday lives, right? Tax credit for the home mortgage deductions, right? It is not a partisan policy, it's just a policy. And so informing people about those, you don't meet that partisan resistance in the way that you do if you're talking about abortion or immigration. It's one thing. And in terms of how do we get this information to people, I think this is something that is this is the new frontier, right? We live in a fragmented media environment now where people are no longer just watching the big three networks. And that's scary, but maybe that's also an opportunity, right? Maybe that is also an opportunity to find more ways to reach people where they are, whether that's on platforms like TikTok or whether that's in civics textbooks, right? When we teach people about how the government works, maybe we should be teaching them about policies as well, especially policies that have been around for decades. So I think that there is a lot of potentially creative options. People still trust local news a lot. One barrier is that a lot of media organizations think that people don't care about policy coverage. I think they're wrong. Again, in the kind of experiments that I have done, I found there's a huge untapped demand. People want to understand how the government is affecting their lived experience, but the media is just giving them horse race coverage. And that is incredibly frustrating for people and causes a lot of them to just tune out of politics altogether. So maybe I am overly optimistic, but I do think that there is a real public demand for this information if we can figure out, as you say, how to get it to them in a way that resonates with their lived experience.
Can I tack on to Curtis's question, since Emily's here and you're the expert? So all the data that I'm seeing on this particular issue, obviously it's kind of given that bimodal where, older generations are still looking at cable news, they're looking at Fox, they're looking at that, but young people are looking at social media, right? And that's not necessarily a problem, and bias isn't necessarily the problem either. The problem is an issue with factual versus non-factual information, right? Even watching a Fox News and MSNBC, from what I've seen, you're still gonna get gently the truth, right? You're gonna get some honesty about how the government works. Whereas a lot of folks who are leaning into TikTok, who are leaning into Twitter as their primary source of news information, you're getting people's opinions. You're getting Jill Stein saying there's 600 people in the Congress, right? She actually said that on the Breakfast Club, 600 people in Congress. So I wanna hear from you, right, that what do we do when you say that this is an opportunity? Because I've felt very disillusioned with this, right? Where people are not checking to see if this is real information. A lot of information comes from Reddit, now, right? Which, who's monitoring that, right? What do we do when people actually don't know how it works and they're getting information from other people who also don't know how government works?
And I will be a little bit more optimistic in that, like, when we look at kind of patterns of political information consumption on social media, the majority of it is actually still through mainstream media. So when people are getting news on social media, whether that's TikTok or Facebook or whatever, they're following the New York Times on Facebook or Fox News on TikTok, right? So we still have these kinds of monopolies of information, which might be good or bad, depending on how you feel about mainstream media. But I mean, that is one kind of guardrail that's up. I don't know if it will be there forever. Yeah, I don't know. This is a great question.
So we're running up against the half hour. So if you have a question, we're going to have a reception right out here with wonderful hors d'oeuvres and drinks. So please come up and see us if you have any additional questions. I would like to take the opportunity to thank the tremendous work of Jackie Nacheski and Kelly Coleman and the Dean's Office. And before we go, let's give it up for the panelists here. Thank you. So I want to end on this, just one quick hit from each panelist. Can you give the students out here one thing that they should do to improve citizenship or democracy? Like 10, 15-second hit from... Yeah.
Get involved in local politics.
Okay.
Okay, I was going to say get involved in local organizing, community organizing.
Okay.
It's hard to beat that, yes. Civic organizations or even just student organizations here on campus will give you the skills necessary when you graduate to lead other organizations.
Okay. Read. All right. Thank you so much. Have a wonderful evening. Thank you again to our panelists.